Alright, so I've been noticing that my how to strip armor video has been getting a lot of traction lately, so what I want to do is basically redo that video and update it with some warframes that I missed, and also some of the warframes that have come out a lot more recently to that video. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first warframe we're going to look at is Revenant. Now, Revenant is a warframe that literally doesn't care about armor at all. And the reason why that is the case is because Revenant is capable of doing true damage to any enemy that he happens to enthrall. The idea is that you set up enemies by thralling them, i.e. you take control of them, and then when you reave through them, reaving through them deals a very certain amount of their health as true damage that completely ignores armor and completely ignores shields. So at that point, Revenant literally doesn't care about armor. You can build a bunch of power strength, and you could take out 50% of a target's health, and at that point with one reave you can go back and forth in front of them, and in doing so you ultimately kill them. This works with any enemy, whether they are the super tanky enemies or the not tanky enemies at all. As long as they can be enthralled, there's a 99% chance that reave one times or two times is going to get them dead. The next warframe who also doesn't care about armor is Garuda. And the reason why is that Garuda's ultimate ability, known as Seeking Talons, is capable of forcing slash procs. Now, by forcing slash procs, what that does is you're going to be doing a lot of damage over time that ignores armor. It goes through armor. And you can pair that with something like her Blood Bomb, which you get from using Dread Mirror, and then by doing so, you get to then charge up your Blood Bomb, unleash your Blood Bomb, it releases a giant AoE, and anyone who happens to be affected by Seeking Talons at the time, well, they basically get a gigantic slash proc. One of the strongest slash procs in the game. And in doing so, you basically get to destroy pretty much the tankiest, most armored enemies in the game with those slash procs. So that's definitely a fantastic option. Another warframe who doesn't give a crap about armor is going to be Ashe, because guess what? Blade Storm does true damage and also provides a slash proc. This is why you can see a lot of Blade Storm do really high damage to really high level enemies. So it's definitely worth checking out with Blade Storm. On top of that, Ashe has an augment for his Shuriken, which basically allows for, I think, single target armor strip. It's not particularly useful when you're surrounded by a ton of enemies, but because Shuriken is such a cheap ability, you should be able to throw out a bunch of Shurikens and you can armor strip everyone. Although whether you do need to armor strip anyone when you have something like Blade Storm to use, well, that's entirely up to you. Keep in mind that Blade Storm is now easier to use in the sense that you don't automatically join Blade Storm. You can decide to join your own Blade Storm if you decide to teleport to any of the targets that are currently being Blade Stormed. In a similar vein, we also have Yareli. You may have wondered, wait, hold on, I wasn't expecting Yareli on this list, but she kind of does count. And the reason why is mainly because of Aqua Blades. Aqua Blades, of course, is an ability that does a lot of slash procs, and quite quickly. The problem is those slash procs don't tend to do a lot of damage, so even in high level games, it's not necessarily the most efficient way to be killing high level enemies, but it's certainly a way where you can avoid that armor just by doing a lot of slash procs. So it kind of works, but just keep in mind that it's not particularly strong. And another alternative is Protea. Now, I don't think anyone really ever uses the slash fans for the damage. Generally speaking, the slash fans are used for the crowd control. They're really good at just staggering enemies en masse in an AoE. But they also provide slash procs, hence the name slash fans, so they also technically ignore armor. Now, Protea also has another ability that innately strips armor, so let's go into a group of warframes who innately strip armor. And Protea's ability that innately strips armor is of course her blaze cannons, because specifically heat procs. Heat procs, by definition, these days, they actually strip 50% of a target's armor. So in doing so, Protea's cannons, not only do they do a lot of damage because they happen to scale massively and infinitely, and to enemy level, they also happen to do heat procs, so that is of course going to be very strong. Now, another warframe who happens to strip armor innately is going to be Nyx. Nyx is able to strip armor through her second ability, known as Psychic Bolts. Psychic Bolts is actually really strong. It does not take a whole lot of power strength to be able to strip 100% of a target's armor. You only just need 20% power strength in addition to your normal power strength. So basically Intensify will do the trick. This also works with stripping shields as well, which kind of makes Nyx one of the strongest Warframes in the game. So absolutely fantastic option to use if you just want to yeet 6 enemies armor. That's the main weakness though, you can only take out 6 enemies armor at a time. But because Psychic Bolts is such a cheap ability, it's actually not that big a deal in my opinion. But alternatively, if you want to do a lot of mass AoE armor stripping, then Oberon is a fantastic option. Because Oberon can actually strip, as far as I can tell, an infinite number of enemies, provided they're all being affected by the Hallowed Ground. When you have enemies who are affected by Hallowed Ground, you can then use his 4th ability, Reckoning, to strip their armor. And it doesn't take a whole lot of power strength to hit the 50% mark, and at that point you're basically using 2 Reckonings and 1 Hallowed Ground in order to strip everyone's armor. Do keep in mind though, that is a pretty huge energy resource in order to do mass armor strip, but thankfully Oberon is a huge rage tank because of his healing factor, so I generally don't think that's a big deal. An alternative to Oberon is of course going to be Vauban. Vauban has a mass AoE armor strip in the form of Bastille. Now Bastille is able to lift up a bunch of enemies, and that number of enemies is apparently affected by power strength. And in lifting up those enemies, he is then able to strip their armor through Bastille. It's any enemy who is affected by the crowd control of Bastille will be armor stripped by Bastille. Now the armor strip happens to be a percentage per second, so basically as long as you have a higher percentage, you will be able to strip their armor even faster. That's essentially how it works. So it's also high scaling armor strip because it's a percentage armor strip as opposed to just a singular number armor strip, so that does make it really strong even in higher level play. And then of course when that Bastille collapses into a vortex, you can then pair it with something like Photon Blast, a gigantic AoE space laser from the sky, and in doing so you get to do a lot of damage. Especially if you're using something like Photon Repeater, but that's just entirely up to you. Another alternative is Gauss. Now, in order for Gauss to do mass AoE armor strip, what you need to do is you need to build up your meter to 100%. Now, in order to do that, there's several options. You could just run, or you just spam the cold part of Thermal Sunder, because apparently that actually builds up your meter pretty damn easily. Now, once you have that meter at 100%, you just go in the middle of a group of enemies, and you proc the blast part of Thermal Sunder. By proccing the blast part of Thermal Sunder, you strip everyone's armor at the same time. This is actually really effective, and does mean you can pair it with something like an explosive weapon, and you can deal a lot more damage to these now unarmored enemies. The next Warframe that can also strip armor innately is going to be Frost. Now the way that it works with Frost is that his avalanche, as soon as it freezes some enemies, will also strip their armor. Now, I don't see a lot of people making use of this, or then again I don't see a lot of Frost being used at this point in time, but he is there, he does exist, and Avalanche is obviously a fantastic way to strip a bunch of armor. Now keep in mind the base armor strip is 40%, which pretty much means you need to build a lot of power strength if you want to get complete armor strip. I'm not entirely sure if that's a viable option, because somehow, some way, shape or form, for the longest time, ever since the game existed, I've actually never really touched Frost. So, I'm not 100% sure. Frostmaze, let me know how you build Frost and whether you even take this into account. I know there's like offensive Frost and defensive Frost, so I'm not really 100% sure if going for mass power strength for that armor strip is actually something that people do. Let me know in the comments. Now, a bit of a weaker alternative to all of these Warframes is going to be Hildryn, purely in regards to armor strip. This is because Hildryn's armor strip comes from the Pillage ability, and unfortunately the Pillage ability only strips a portion of a target's armor at any given point in time, i.e. you're not stripping a portion of a target's base armor or their immediate initial armor, you're only stripping a portion of their armor at that point in time. That means using Pillage multiple times will get you diminishing returns, which is a little bit unfortunate. It also means that you do need to do a bit of a calculation if you want to determine how many pillages you're going to need to do to enemies in order to fully strip them of their armor. It's not as simple as 100 divided by your percentage. You're going to have to do some actual math. And in a similar fashion, we also have Nekros. The thing about Nekros' armor strip is that it has a very low value in the way of percentage to begin with, so even building up high power strength, which is generally not something you do with Nekros as far as I know, is probably not going to be that effective anyway. But either way, he is able to strip armor through his Terrify ability, but I feel like most people use that to scare enemies and prevent them from shooting you, and instead have them run around and be completely useless to themselves, and at that point then you can just kill them. Having that extra armor strip, I guess, does make it easy to kill them, so that's of course going to be a welcome addition. Now we also have a couple of Warframes who, like Protea, are able to strip armor through a status proc. Now the first one is going to be Saryn. Saryn, of course, is the queen of corrosive toxin viral procs, and that's what Saryn can do. Her spores provide corrosive procs, and when you spread those spores then provide corrosive procs to whoever they happen to hit, which is of course going to be very, very useful. And on top of that, the spores are also going to be doing a bunch of damage to enemies as well. Keep in mind that corrosive procs, they cap at about 75% armor reduction at the 10 corrosive proc level, so that's going to be something you're going to have to keep an eye on. Is it 80? I can't remember. But either way, Saryn can then of course pair that with the vast viral proc through the use of Miasma, and you're effectively doing a lot of extra damage with Saryn. This kind of makes her really, really good at just dealing with everything in Steel Path. Another alternative for corrosive procs is going to be Wisp. Now in order for Wisp to do any corrosive procs, she first must have the haste mode active around her person. You of course basically just summon a haste mode, stand next to the haste mode provider, you get yourself your haste mode, and then boom, that's it. We have corrosive procs available for the Soul Beam, the gigantic mega sun beam of death. That particular laser beam is then able to provide corrosive procs, which in turn increase the amount of damage that it's doing against armored enemies. This makes it very, very powerful at just wiping out even higher level enemies, because once they lose all of their armor, well, they're basically sitting ducks. So generally speaking, even the highest level of enemies are basically made of paper when they're completely unarmored, or even mostly unarmored. Another alternative is going to be Lavos. Now Lavos is the king of all elements in terms of switching between all sorts of elements. So basically all you gotta do is infuse any of your abilities with corrosive by holding down the 1 and the 3 button, I believe. 1 of course being your toxin proc, 3 of course being your electric proc. Combine those two together and what do you get? You get corrosive procs, and in doing so all of your abilities are able to do corrosive procs. You can then of course use, for example, your Vile Dash. That will of course provide a giant zone of corrosive procs, or you use your third ability which will produce a giant AoE of corrosive procs, and then use your fourth ability and infuse it with a different element if you want, and at that point that ability will then take into account the fact that there are different elements affecting other enemies, and it will do a lot of extra damage. It is a very, very powerful way for Lavos to basically wipe out entire rooms of very armored enemies. Another Warframe who is able to provide a lot of heat procs is Ember. Now Ember is able to provide heat procs because her entire kit is based on fire. But what she can also do, which is what will bring us to the innate ability Warframes, is that her Fire Blast, especially when you build up her meter, is able to fully strip armor. So once you have Immolation meter at 90%, if you drop a Fire Blast in order to bring down the Immolation meter, it also strips the armor of all nearby enemies, so that makes it really, really damn strong. Speaking of innate abilities, let's have a look at the other Warframes with innate abilities. For example, Nyx. Alright, let's have a look at all of the Warframes who are able to strip armor through the use of an augment. First one we're going to talk about is Mag. Now I know, Mag has an innate ability to strip armor as well through the use of Polarize. However, Polarize strips a certain amount of armor as a set number. What that means is that in higher level missions, this particular ability doesn't scale at all. Such is the nature of Polarize. But when you use the augment for Crush, known as Fracturing Crush, suddenly Mag's armor stripping actually scales massively, because with 160% power strength, or the closest you can get to 160% power strength, you reach the cap of Fracturing Crush, and in doing so you can use Crush to strip 80% of all nearby targets' armor. That's 80% of a target's armor, no questions asked. Keep in mind this is kind of like pillage, where it's going to be 80% of a target's armor at this particular point in time. So if you were to, for example, oh I don't know, stack 2 fracturing crushes together, you're effectively yeeting 96% of a target's armor if you're using 160% power strength. You can then of course finish off whatever remains with a polarize, and that's exactly how I use Mag to do mass armor strip. There is of course some much more powerful alternatives, for example Banshee's Sonic Boom. Now Sonic Boom requires about 45% additional energy, give or take about 3%, and in doing so you can just strip everyone's armor who happens to be in front of you. Keep in mind the Sonic Boom will also fling them backwards, so just take that into consideration if you're trying to shoot them with something like a bow afterwards. Let them land first so that you know where they are, and then just shoot them. It's basically just easy mode 100% armor strip with one button, and that's what makes Banshee quite strong. Obviously there are other abilities that make her quite strong as well, but I think Sonic Boom is something that we should definitely not be discounting. The next Warframe who uses an augment to strip armor is going to be Trinity. Now I know you can actually build Trinity with super duper high power strength to do ridiculous damage through the use of Energy Vampire. This of course is going to be really high single target true damage, which completely ignores armor, so that should put her in the same category as someone like Revenant. The only thing is, I don't really consider Trinity to be a DPS character, and I don't think anyone really considers Trinity to be a DPS hero outside of course, the handful of Trinity mains who actually want to play her as a DPS hero, and fair enough. But on top of that, Trinity also has an augment called Abating Link, and what this does is any enemy who is affected by Link, which means 3 enemies that are near you, with a lot of power strength you can strip a whole lot of their armor, which is fine because EV. So at that point it becomes a really powerful option to just strip a bunch of armor. And with the way that Link works, if you're using for example a high power single target weapon like Yapara's Prime, then all you gotta do is just figure out which enemy is being linked, and you'll notice the one that has no armor, kill it, your link will then swap to another target, kill it, your link will then swap to another target, kill it, etc, etc. And finally we have Hydroid, who is able to provide corrosive procs through the use of his Tempest Barrage augment, known as Corroding Barrage. It is a giant AoE corrosive proc, so that is kind of useful. You can definitely pair it up with something like his puddle, and one of the fun things to do is to basically grab as many enemies as you can in the puddle, and then chuck a Tempest Barrage on top of you with the Corroding Barrage augment, and in doing so you will find that the puddle with its growing damage will then do a lot of damage against all of those seemingly unarmored enemies, to the point where they all just start suddenly dying in the puddle. So that's of course going to be really fun. So aside from these Warframes, we might as well mention the other Warframes that could technically also strip armor. So that's of course every single Warframe with an Exalted ability. So you can actually mod those Exalted abilities for corrosive procs, and in doing so that's how you would strip armor. That would include Excalibur Umbra, Valkyria, Mesa, Titania, Sevagoth, insert someone that I forgot who happens to have an Exalted weapon. Don't forget we also have Kavats, including Venari, so that basically beats Korra as well, who are able to strip armor through the use of the Sharpened Claws mod. This is actually a really powerful mod, and the way it upgrades, when you max out the Sharpened Claws mod, you actually end up doing about 120% of a target's armor, or thereabouts. That 120% doesn't actually mean anything, in the sense that that extra 20% is completely meaningless. You are basically just removing 100% of a target's armor when that cat decides to attack any target. The Sharpened Claws mod will then kick in and just remove 100% of their armor. So that's pretty much it. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. What is your favorite Warframe when it comes to stripping armor? Do you even need a Warframe to strip armor? Especially when you have a lot of weapons that could potentially just strip armor for you, as well as including any other bonuses. My personal favorite weapon for that kind of scenario is of course the Staff of Armadil, the Scourge, and if you want to check out my Staff of Armor build, just have a look around for it, I'm sure it's there somewhere. But either way, hope you guys enjoyed this. If you liked this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Warframe content, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye!